Hi there, welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you here on the SaltWire Network. And I'll invite you again to look for our new YouTube channel, a great place for you to catch up on some of the great work that my colleagues are doing at SaltWire and across the region. The Prime Minister of Canada, members of Parliament in the Liberal Party caucus are all together at a cabinet retreat in Hamilton, Ontario. And they're telling us that, well, this is about making life more affordable, build an economy that works for all Canadians. And, this happens on a fairly regular basis and obviously ahead of the spring sitting of the House of Commons. So what does it really matter? What does it mean? Given that we've had this ongoing conversation here in Nova Scotia about healthcare and the politics of healthcare, and you're elected to fix healthcare, that bar is pretty high. You've raised expectations. And I'm always so grateful for the time of our next guest. Dr. Lori Turnbull is the director of the School of Public Administration, an associate professor of political science at Dalhousie University. She joins us today. So nice to see you again. Thank you very much for joining me.
Anytime, Sheldon. Thanks for having me.
Before we talk about what's happening in Ottawa, I'd just like to get your perhaps perspective on what had happened. Obviously, here in Nova Scotia, we had two very high-profile deaths from women who went to emergency care, who did not receive the care that they were hoping for or expecting. And then we've had reaction from government. We've had reaction from the health authority. When you put out there in the world that you want to fix healthcare, and you raise that level of expectation, what's your thought of the way that the political messaging has been handled since the new year and since that took place?
Okay, so that was those are such tragic stories, and they really grip people because they completely challenge our hope that if we need the healthcare system, it will be there for us. And I think for a long time, the debate has been about things like the length of a wait time and your quality of life being diminished by having to wait for a service to have to, or for a health service to have to wait for a doctor to have, that sort of thing. But the idea that you might wait and wait and wait and it doesn't come and you'll die or your family member will die, that is not acceptable to people. And so it completely throws everything, I think, in a new space where I can see people having conversations about changing the way we approach healthcare that we've never had before. I think for the Houston government, like any government in a position like this, of course he promised big on healthcare. He wanted to win the election. And he knew he could win the election because there was a sense of voter fatigue with the Liberals, and he knows that healthcare is on everyone's mind and is usually the most important issue to people. And so he promised big on healthcare. Not the first one to do that. He gets elected, and it's going to take him a long time to make the kinds of changes that people are really going to feel. And it's also not totally up to him. And so that's why we see him, like the rest of the premiers, engaged in this ongoing conversation with the federal government about the transfer of money to the provinces so that they are better able to respond to the healthcare needs of the populations. So he's in the same spot as everybody else.
Okay, so that in keeping that in mind in this cabinet summit, this cabinet getaway, and invariably the conversation turns to healthcare. The federal position has been, well, yes, it's not just about the money. We want to make sure that what's being spent on is going to make a difference. And I think you can make a pretty good argument. Healthcare spending has increased exponentially, yet the outcomes are not going in the same direction. So, people in the system say it's a human resource issue, but it's right across this country. So what as a federal government do you do with the overlapping jurisdictions of what is responsible for, the provinces to deliver the healthcare, but the federal government to spend on the healthcare?
Right. So that's the thing, right? Is that we've got a constitution that gives the provinces jurisdiction for healthcare, which means they are the ones that are able to legislate in that area, and they're the ones that are supposed to fill the space. But because healthcare has grown so much since the Constitution was written, and it continues to grow in terms of people's expectations about what the system is going to provide, the kinds of services that are needed, the costs of those services, this all keeps getting bigger. And the provinces are not able to foot the bill on their own. So the federal government comes in as the money supply because their fiscal capacity is much higher, but their ability to respond to local needs is not the same as a local government would be. So not the same as a provincial government would be. And so the arrangement is something like the feds give the provinces money. The provinces are supposed to agree to some some conditions in some cases, and then other times there are no conditions attached. But there's an idea that, look, if we're going to give you this money, we want to make sure it's spent for the right things. Provinces will push back on that and say, no, like, you're not the only people who can talk about quality standards in healthcare. We can do that. We don't need to be told what to do. And I think that's where the needle is shifting a bit in the conversations that are happening now that make them different than the conversations that we were having like in the 90s. Because Trudeau is in the same position as, a very similar position as Chrétien and Martin were in the 2000s, and then, 90s going into 2000s, when they're trying to figure out how to fix healthcare. The premiers are screaming, everybody's screaming that the system is broken, and they're trying to get a deal. And for Trudeau, I think one of the big differences is that at that time, nobody wanted to talk about private care. It was political suicide for you to talk about private care. But now, Doug Ford is saying he wants to introduce a lot more privatization in terms of service delivery in Ontario, and he's factoring that out over time. And Trudeau is saying that's innovative. So something has shifted here where we don't have to just talk about public care anymore. We're talking about other things, and it doesn't mean necessarily paying with your credit card. It means we are actually going to talk about how provinces need to do this differently. So I think what we are going to see is very different rhetoric. We're going to see different solutions applied in different provinces to a larger degree than we ever have before. And the feds have to decide how they want to manage not only the outcomes, but the communications around those things. Like, I think Trudeau is playing it smart now, where he's letting Doug Ford do this. He's not discouraging or dissuading. He's not putting his arms around it either. He's just, like, we're going to let the provinces sort this out, and we're going to be there on the back end to do it. But what does that mean for a province like Nova Scotia, where our economy is doing better, but the population is still quite a bit smaller, obviously, drastically smaller, older. And so healthcare is going to require different things, and the government's going to have to take a different approach.
I guess the argument in Ontario is that you don't care who you're being seen by, provided you're not paying out of pocket to get that care. And, that might crack the door open to a high-level philosophical discussion about neoliberalism and where that whole, privatization platform takes a government. But I guess to come back to Tim Houston's point, when he was elected, he said, it's going to be expensive and it's going to take time. He was very clear to say, it could be into or past 2025, very much setting all of our expectations at he's going to need 2 terms to do that. But do you think there's a capacity, and again, to kind of bring it back provincially, sure, you get more money from the federal government, but until we start to see a turnaround, until we start to see a change in the outcomes, for the better, that's a hard sell too. But again, I don't know who's waiting to take over. Claudia Chandra is a new leader. Zach Churchill is a new leader. Yeah. And we're still 3 years away from the next election.
That's it. And so, I think just to kind of bring the Doug Ford piece into the conversation, because I think it helps to compare in order to sort of get a sense of what the political terrain is in Nova Scotia. Because in some ways, we have these 3 political parties in the province who don't always sound terribly different from one another. And if you go back to the 2021 election, I really felt like the leaders could have exchanged speaking points and you wouldn't have known. Like, they're talking about health, they're talking about housing. Some put the emphasis here rather than there, but essentially, is there huge spaces between them? No. And so it becomes, who do you trust to do what we need to do on healthcare, instead of the parties promising wildly different things. It's about which leader do you actually trust to implement it, and who do you think will get it done? Doug Ford's communication is all about, doesn't matter who does it. The point is, we need the service. And Doug Ford is in an ideological space, and has always been, that the smaller government is the better. The government's not terribly good at everything. And so let's find ways to bring you the services you need by entities that are better equipped to give them to you. And so could that sort of rhetoric and thinking ever apply in Nova Scotia? And I'm not saying it should, but if it did, that's a way that the debate around service delivery would expand a lot. Now, obviously, we do have some privatization in service delivery, but Doug Ford's talking about doing something quite, it's not just a question of opening up more cataract offices, even though that's the case in the beginning. He's talking about quite a bit more private involvement. And it would, is that model transferable? Is that something that we should be talking more about? Stephen McNeil used to talk about having everybody have a family doctor is impossible, and we need to think more about community care. Like, is that? But Houston has been, no, everybody gets a family doctor. What if he has to eat that at some point? Like, what if he has to come back and say, actually, no, like, I can't do this, and so let's talk about something else? Does he have the kind of public support he would need to be able to move opinion with him and show up differently on a question that's so important, and still kind of keep enough support with him to keep winning?
Yeah, I see Tim Houston having the work of his deputies, his ministers, and others trying to say, we're doing virtual emergent care, we're doing mobile health clinics. He's trying to get, I think, a message out there that, that list, the one that he used to hammer Stephen McNeil with, is, well, maybe not as accurate, because, some people might be on the list who moved here, who didn't take themselves off the list. Any number of reasons why people might question that. There was a call in Nova Scotia for an emergency debate on the healthcare issue because of the crisis over the holidays and obviously the tragic deaths of these two women. That didn't happen. You're in Ottawa. This caucus retreat is about getting ready for the upcoming session in the House of Commons. And then people ask, well, the value of the institution, the relevance in their lives. It's hard enough to get people to pay attention to news, let alone to policy issues. And, the House and the party and government is the party that drives the agenda. So your business is watching this stuff. Are people engaged? Are people paying attention? Do people even care about what's happening in those houses of the public?
Honestly, I don't think that Parliament has ever been less relevant than it is now. Like, I absolutely think that the deal that the NDP has with the government has had the effect of really making debate in the House of Commons far less relevant and far less consequential, because instead of saying to the government, we are going to make you work for our support every time, every bill, the NDP has said, okay, we're good for these 5 or 6 things. And, as long as you keep going on those things and make progress, then we're okay. And we're not going to cause an election. Now, some might argue that there's a lot of value to that. And if you see this kind of deal endure over time, it could be good in the sense that you get to go back to your point about how long it's going to take for Houston to get results on healthcare. Well, if you're looking at something like healthcare, climate change, like something that's going to take a while to implement, having some stability in Parliament and having the parties be able to work together on something can help with long-term planning, because there's a sense that, this isn't just something we have to shove into a 4-year or shorter electoral cycle. This is something that could, endure over time, and we'd have more time to work on it. But in this case, none of despite the fact that they signed this deal in March of last year, there is still election speculation all the time. Like, there's no culture change here. The parties have not really meaningfully come together and said, like, okay, we're going to start working together in a way that totally changes the way parties work in the House of Commons. That would have been very interesting and perhaps invigorating to Parliament, actually. But instead, you get it's pretty quiet. And the government is very much focused on, and, understandably, the relationship with the US, what we're doing in Ukraine. Their focus is very global. And again, the false dichotomy between external issues, international issues, and domestic issues drives me crazy, because what's happening in terms of the supply chain, what's happening in terms of our relationship with the US and other partners is completely consequential in terms of what happens domestically. So it's not two different worlds. But Justin Trudeau's focus right now, it seems to me, is quite on what happens outside of Parliament. And I think he wouldn't be the only prime minister to do that. But I do get the sense that people are not as switched on to what's happening in Parliament, even less than they used to be. Voter turnout in the Ontario election last year was in the toilet. And Quebec was good, but Quebec's usually good. But you've got Doug Ford making major changes to how Ontario is governed, when 43% of people showed up to vote, and 39% of them voted for him. So he's making some pretty big changes on like 17-18% of eligible voters. And when you don't have that engagement from the sort of the bulk of the population, I think what ends up happening is the ideas that come through the system don't get put through the same filter.
Right.
Even when Trudeau, and I'll be quiet in a minute here, even when Trudeau said the other day, there should be a political consequence to proactive, preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause. Well, I agree with him. But what he's really saying is, why the hell aren't voters angry with premiers who are doing this? Like, why is it me who has to say, don't ride all over people's rights or I'll take you to court? Like, where are the people? But a politician can't say that. He can't go up to the microphone and blame voters. So he's sort of trying to skirt his way there. But I get it, right? Like, people are switched off and we need to figure out how to switch back on.
Looking at the agenda for this cabinet retreat, ongoing efforts to make Canada more affordable and to build an economy that works. So you're Pierre Poilievre, and you look at that and you go, okay, I've got him on my message now. Tim Houston was very public in saying, just a few weeks ago, in spite of the pundits, in spite of those pollsters, our government, we made government. Are we in any way looking down the path to say Pierre Poilievre at some point is going to say, in spite of what the pundits and in spite of what the pollster said, I'm your prime minister. I'm in charge now. Does that happen, do you think?
I mean, I certainly don't think it's impossible. There would have been a time where if you said to me, is Pierre Poilievre ever going to be Prime Minister of Canada? And I would have laughed. But now, no, I think it's completely within the possible. I think that what is going to be difficult for him, obviously there's a few things, right? Like he came to the leadership of the party after a race that was essentially a foregone conclusion. So there was very little for him by way of honeymoon bump because everybody knew he was going to win. People knew him already too. And so some of the kind of excitement that comes around a new leader, I found like, and in the polls too, like it didn't happen for him in the same way. Now he's trying to build support in a way that will help him win an election, not win a leadership. And they're very different exercises, obviously. But we can see how he's limited in his appeal to women, voters in Quebec and Ontario. So it's possible, and they're the populous provinces. He's got to figure out how to bust into that scene, or else he runs the risk of continuing to build on the Conservative share of the popular vote, particularly in the western part of the country, but not winning enough seats to form government. So speaking of institutions and people having trust in them, we're going to see the strains of the electoral system interacting with the party system and spitting out a result that makes people angry. Because you've got a whole lot of coalescing on the progressive side, but the progressive votes being split between the Liberals and the NDP. You're getting votes there for the Conservatives, and according to some polls, they're like 7 points ahead, but not in a way that's necessarily going to help them build seats. And so, and then there's the bloc. So it's kind of, I don't know. It just seems to me that we are really getting to a point where the institutions, people are rightly frustrated with some of the institutional outcomes here because it's not working for people.
Heard someone ask, where are the Nova Scotia MPs? We're not hearing from them. Obviously, we have Sean Fraser, Minister of Immigration. So at this caucus retreat, do you think somebody stands up and says, thank you for your service, Mr. Trudeau, but I think it's time someone else takes this party into the next election?
I don't think, okay, that's a great question. Especially in the kind of wake of the Prime Minister of New Zealand deciding to step away, it seems to me that's a clear, Justin Trudeau wakes up, reads the newspaper. If he doesn't see, a kind of question mark here for himself, that would be kind of hard to understand. I mean, I don't know that political parties were ever nailing it on like leadership transition. Because we have a parliamentary system, there's no term limits for prime ministers. It's always going to be that awkward conversation, elephant in the room. And especially when a prime minister is young, like Trudeau's like 51. Like, it's not like he's running out of steam or something. To the contrary, I mean, he seems to be he seems to be as energetic as he ever was, which is significantly energetic. I don't know that there's a way for parties to have that conversation without causing instability. We are so, we really don't have that path to transition carved out. And now parties are so responsive to the leader. When a new leader takes over, the party just wraps itself around the leader. The organization of the party changes. The personnel of the party changes. There's not the same machine that goes forward even as leadership changes. Even the change between Chrétien and Martin, there was more stability there, despite the hate, than there is now. And I think that's a big reason why when Stephen McNeil walked away, like nobody wanted it, because it was like, that's how little parties are planning leaders transitions. It's too awkward. It's too destabilizing.
It takes an election loss or some major scandal, which we haven't seen too many scandals for the most part. And I guess the last point, you were in Ottawa during the protests. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the mandate protests, the truckers' convoy, as it's called. Apparently, some folks were protesting out front of the caucus retreat in Hamilton, Ontario, shooting fireworks off. And there's probably more to come. Does the Prime Minister risk anything by finally addressing or coming out and saying, hey, we're listening, but, whatever? Like, that was part of the criticism before, that he didn't listen. And I'm just curious where there's this foreshadowing of at least some appearance of a repeat of some of that does he do anything different this time?
So I think that when he gave his appearance and his testimony into the public emergence, like the commission, Justice Rollo's commission, I think the way he explained the difference between a legitimate and an illegitimate, a legitimate protest and an illegitimate occupation, he made that distinction very clearly. And that was a pivotal part of his testimony and why the government chose to do what it did. And so I think he has to stick with that. In my view, that was the strongest he had ever been as Prime Minister. None of the virtue signaling and the performance and it was just straight answers to questions. Why did I do this? This is why. And so given that, I don't think he can back away from that. If there is a protest, if people are out in the streets and there's no occupation and people are just waving signs, yeah, he might go talk to them. But he's not going to go talk to them and shake their hand. He might address what's going on, but I don't think he's ever going to do anything that would create doubt around his justification for why he decided to use the Emergencies Act.
And clearly he's positioned Pierre Poilievre as supporting that, and there's the distinct line between the two of them.
Oh, yeah. He's got good reason to keep those compartments very separate.
Well, this does nothing to help want people to enter the world of politics, all that's happening. So I certainly do thank you for the time that you've given. And anything else we want to add, Dr. Turnbull?
No, I talked too much already.
It's all good. Dr. Lori Turnbull is the Director of the School of Public Administration, Associate Professor of Political Science at Dalhousie University. Thank you so much.
Thank you, too.